Russian citizens of various ethnic backgrounds have been involved in conflict in Syria nearly since the beginning of conflict, but definitely quite actively since 2012. And they joined jihadist groups and non-jihadist groups supporting elements of Syrian opposition at that time. Many went there to support the cause to support the Syrian people. They watched the videos, they watched the photographs of Syrian civilian casualties, and they felt that this is their duty as Muslims to go there and do something to protect these women and children. And many went there with no intention to die. Sometimes they would treat it almost nearly like Hajj, they went for 2, 3 months and then came back, kind of fulfilling their religious obligation. Recruitment really spiked with the emergence of ISIS, however. So starting from 2014, Russian citizens, mostly from the North Caucasus, have been recruited as volunteer fighters in very significant numbers. By 2016, the Russian Interior Ministry estimated the number of Russian citizens fighting in ISIS only as 3,417. And they were also Russian citizens fighting in non-ISIS groups, together with al-Nusra, former al-Nusra Front, but also in numerous small independent groups, which were often led by Chechen commanders, and they fought either independently or in alliance with other smaller, bigger groups, usually in around Latakia and Idlib. Mostly the Russian jihadists came, as I mentioned, from the North Caucasus, which is the southern region of Russia, predominantly Muslim, and it has been affected by armed conflict since early 1990s, since 1994, when the first Chechen war broke out. Initially, it was a nationalist separatist war, which aimed to create an independent Chechen state. But gradually, the conflict transformed into a more Islamist, jihadist cause. By 2007, the Chechen insurgency spilled out to the entire North Caucasus, affecting the neighboring regions. And a new organization was declared, it was called Imarat Kafkas in 2007, and it aimed to build a Sharia-based Islamist state on the territory of the entire North Caucasus. And basically, it was a guerrilla warfare, and for quite a few years, it was one of the deadliest conflicts in Europe. The jihadists from Imarat Kafkas started to join, as I mentioned, the conflict even before ISIS. At that time, the leadership of Imarat Kafkas supported that to an extent because they thought that this is a way to get combat experience for the young fighters, to integrate them better into the international jihadi landscape. They thought that they would fight there and come back. But as Imarat Kafkas was loosely affiliated with Al-Qaeda, once the schism between and the conflict between ISIS and Al-Qaeda was getting deeper, this schism also transformed on the ground, and Imarat Kafkas became strongly against the departure of Russian jihadists to Syria and Iraq. However, they were unable to compete with the very strong messaging of ISIS, which created a special Russian-speaking media machine of recruitment, which has been extremely effective, and recruited people from the North Caucasus, but not only from across the country in quite significant numbers. And both men and women, their propaganda was gender-specific. It targeted specific ethnic groups in Russia. They played on numerous grievances that the Russian Muslim populations had against the Russian state globally, and this way they mobilized hundreds. The Russian government's response initially was to nearly close eyes, to say the least. Or some local experts and Russian experts think that the Russian security services, to a significant extent, facilitated this exodus of radical people to the Middle East. Why this happened was because the emergence of ISIS and of the even before the emergence of ISIS, the emergence of these strong jihadist groups in Syria coincided with a very important political, it's a sportive event, but it was also a political event for Russia, the Sochi Olympics, which took place in 2004 and early 2014. The Sochi is located in the North Caucasus region, very close to the area of open conflict, and they were at that time still very acute security threats. Moreover, Imarat Kafkas, this jihadi organization, issued serious threats, and they promised to disrupt the Sochi Olympics by all means available, and they committed a series of terrorist attacks around the area. So the Russian security services had the task to very quickly secure the entire region for all potential threats related to Sochi Olympics. So in 2014, they started a major mob-up operation of fundamentalist Muslims across the region, but particularly in Dagestan, also in Chechnya. There were massive arrests of Muslims, of fundamentalist Muslims, Salafi Muslims from mosques, 50, 80, 100 people at a time. They would be detained, brought to police stations, fingerprinted. Lots of imams. Mosques were closed. Some imams were arrested, some disappeared. There were arbitrary arrests, torture, detentions. So very visible pressure on both Salafi on Salafi believers, on Salafi leaders, on Salafi businesses, on mosques, on any civic activity, like there was a Salafi football league, for example, or small Salafi radio in Dagestan. So all of this was crashed, and people started to flee, basically. Many of them resettled to Turkey, but some of them became sensitive to the propaganda of the radical ideologists in Syria, and either joined ISIS directly or first went to Turkey, where Russian speakers formed enclaves, somehow nearly fully Russian-speaking enclaves around Istanbul, where they lived in compact fashion. They had their own doctors, teachers, taxi drivers, and so they had quite tight communities, self-sustainable communities, and a lot of recruitment happened from there as well. And ISIS recruited very strategically. They managed to recruit some of the celebrity imams from Dagestan, the imams with already great following, big social capital, and once they were settled, their followers as well moved with their families to the Middle East. As for Chechnya, this was a bit of a different story because the Chechens have been fighting. There has been the strong separatist movement which transformed them into Islamists, but it was still very strong anti-Russian political and military movement and insurgency movement. And the Chechens basically went to Syria to continue their unfinished war in Russia. Because the Russians took control and established a very dictatorial regime in Chechnya, a regime which is very loyal to the Kremlin, there was no space for them to continue their fighting in the Caucasus. So they saw it as a way to continue fighting Putin by fighting his ally in the Middle East. And the Chechens very quickly made careers in the jihadist structures. They were famous for being fearless fighters, and they very quickly moved up to middle or even upper echelons of power in ISIS, particularly military power. And they continued to recruit, having this social capital already there. They continued to recruit people from Russia. There has been not that much return of jihadists, hardcore jihadist people who fought from Syria and Iraq back to Russia. People did return in rather small numbers at the initial stage, when usually these were people who went and with romantic aspirations, those who believed this Islamic utopia that ISIS was trying to sell to its recruits across the world. And they very quickly, once they arrived, they understood that this is not what they were looking for, and they found a way to escape, and then they escaped. And there were certain mechanisms in place in the North Caucasus. They were called commissions for rehabilitation of fighters. They existed in 3 of the North Caucasus republics, in Dagestan, Ingushetia, and Kabardino-Balkaria. They worked under the auspices of the regional leaders, where people could apply, and then their applications would be reviewed by the commissions, and they would either get minimal sentences, or they would even be exempt from criminal liability, because according to the Russian criminal law, if you participated in an illegal armed group but you voluntarily surrendered to the authorities, unless there is no other crime committed, you can be exempt from criminal liability. So this provision of the Russian criminal law was used in such cases, and people returned. And some of them served sentences, others didn't. But these were actually really small numbers. Because, as I mentioned, the Russian security services at a certain till the end of 2014, they at least closed their eyes on the mass exodus of jihadists, or significantly facilitated by these repressive measures the outflow of radicals from Russia to the Middle East. But then they understood very well that one day they can come back home, and they will represent a real threat, because this would be battle-hardened, radicalized people. So what they did, they tried to create lists of all those who left. They instigated criminal cases against them, which were, of course, then people would be put on the wanted lists and databases at the borders. And they increased criminal sentences for such crimes, so that people would be facing long prison terms between 7 and 50 up to 20, or even life sentence in jail for fighting outside Russian borders. And so, everybody who knows a little bit about the situation in the North Caucasus also knows about a very widespread application of torture, for example, to people suspected of participation in insurgency. There's also there's very little hope that the person would get really fair trial and would be sentenced for what he or she really did. So falsifications of criminal cases, people understand that when they will come back, even if they are ready to serve certain sentences, there will be no fair trial. There were not so many people, fighters, eager to return in the first place. However, women and children did try to return. From the very beginning of conflict, they were trying to find ways to get out. And the commissions, which I mentioned before, some of them worked at the local level. They did informally, very quietly, facilitate such returns. So women could, or their relatives could, apply to these commissions, who then served as a kind of bridge between security services and the returnees, check their files with the Federal Security Service, see what the guarantees could be, and then kind of assisted them in the whole process. People quietly returned, and women and children stayed at home usually. But then in August 2017, for the first time, there was a big public event associated with the return, when the leader of the Chechen Republic, Ramzan Kadyrov, facilitated the return of the first Chechen child from Syria to Chechnya. He, by accident, saw the footage of this child in the ruins of Aleppo, I think of Aleppo. His mother was killed, and his father was captured by the government forces and probably facing a death penalty or life sentence. But the boy was injured and dirty and really clearly suffering. So the relatives in Chechnya identified this boy, and Ramzan Kadyrov stepped in, and he made him found, and he facilitated his return. This was the first child Bilal Tagirov brought back on the 2nd of August 2017. And since then, the Chechen leader initiated the return of Russian women and children from Syria and Iraq. He convinced the federal government that this should be done. Putin gave him full support. He said that children, he emphasized that children should be returned. They shouldn't be left there in the battlefield. And between August and December, around 100 women and children were returned from Syria, mostly from Syria, but also some from Iraq. In December, the returns stopped. And of course, this was a highly publicized event, process. It was shown on federal TV channels. The high federal officials were meeting the planes at the airports in Moscow. Sometimes they would fly to Moscow, sometimes directly to Grozny, the capital of Chechnya. So there would be highest level officials. There would be a lot of footage, there were lots of stories of these children. So there was a lot of hope among the relatives who were searching all these years for their children and grandchildren who were caught in this situation in the war zone and in the Middle East. They all flocked to Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, where a local NGO was tasked with receiving the applications, making a database, and basically managing the relations with the families. Today, this NGO has a list of 1,500 women and children who are still thought to be in Syria and Iraq. So there was a lot of pressure coming from these families to continue the search, because oftentimes the precise location of these women and children is unknown. Some of them contacted their relatives a few months ago, some of them over a year ago. Children and women are staying, some of them in detention facilities, some in unofficial detention facilities, some of them in their husbands were separated from them. The whereabouts of men are usually unknown. So there's a lot of work which has to be done in trying to locate them. And then it's a lot of paperwork, of course, too, because they don't have any documents. As we know, ISIS withdraws their papers upon arrival. And then many children who were already born in Russia, in ISIS, they don't have Russian citizenship automatically. So there's a whole procedure that has to be undertaken on the Russian side, but also negotiations with the Iraqi and Syrian authorities. So it takes, of course, time, effort. And it seems that the Iraqi authorities, at least, are reluctant to give them back. Or at least this is what the Russian government is telling these families, that the Iraqi society wants redress, and they want to see these women of ISIS punished, and the trials will be ongoing. In April, at least 21 Russian women were sentenced to life in prison for participation in ISIS. Their small infants are staying together with them in pretty miserable conditions in the jails. Malnutrition, lacking medical help, medical aid, sometimes adequate clothing. So their fate at the moment is unknown. Since December, returns have stopped, as I mentioned. The representatives of families had meetings with the ambassadors of Syria and Iraq in Moscow. And as the families tell us, the ambassadors of both countries said that they have no problems with returning Russian women and children back, but the Russian government doesn't want to take them. The director of the Russian Federal Security Services, Alexander Bortnikov, in December said that the return of fighters from Syria and Iraq represents a serious threat to Russia. So, of course, there's a lot of fear among the families that it is the Federal Security Services that actually doesn't want to continue this effort. However, it seems that the Foreign Ministry is still committed, at least to return the children. At the first stage, they will probably return children who already have papers, those who were born in Russia and they are confirmed Russian citizens. Then they will work on the other small infants. With the women, it is much more complicated. It is not clear whether or not they will be returned. It seems that at least in Iraq, The court sentences will continue, and maybe afterwards, when the situation calms down, everybody forgets about this issue a little bit. Maybe then the Russian government will try to negotiate their repatriation and deportation. Well, as I mentioned before, the Sochi Olympics, Russia has undertaken a major law enforcement effort to crush its local insurgency. And to a great extent, it was crushed locally on the ground. The existing networks were um, eliminated. Many rank and file and leaders were killed in the North Caucasus. Their communications, their logistics were made very difficult. At the same time, they facilitated the exodus of all potential fighters because most of the people who joined, they didn't have previous battle experience. They were those who could potentially join, but they didn't. These were new recruits. So the exodus of all this radical element helped to a very significant extent to calm the North Caucasus down. So the culmination of this law enforcement measures and closing eyes, or to a significant extent facilitating um, the outflow of fighters, resulted in a situation when today the North Caucasus has really calmed down. The numbers of casualties are very small compared to in the last 3 years. It has really, really calmed. Pretty much very low intensity conflict continues. There's some ISIS affiliated attacks. There are some cells. FSB, Federal Security Services, is regularly declaring that they have discovered yet another ISIS sleeper cell in the North Caucasus or across the country. ISIS has claimed around 20 attacks on the Russian territory since 2014, but there's no issue of full-fledged jihadi insurgency in Russia anymore, and the situation with terrorist threats is very significantly improved.